a lot of us have been using the term complexity to describe a lot of what we've been talking about. And I happen to have an interest in complexity theory and its relationship to educational change. And I thought it would be worth just talking to you for 5 or 10 minutes about an understanding of educational change and how to initiate change and how to sustain educational change through the lens of complexity theory. Quite possibly you have read a fair bit in this, and so bear with me. This is going to be very, very elementary and assumes no prior knowledge of the field at all. But I just thought it was worthwhile including a consideration of complexity theory into our discussions, especially as we're now moving towards next steps and how do we actually start to make changes and so on. It's also understood as a dynamical systems theory, but that's not going to make much sense to you right now. What I'm going to conclude from this very short introduction is that complexity theory says to us that what we should do is to intervene at every possible level, if we can, and from every possible angle. And it points practically to an approach to development which talks about integrated service delivery. In other words, coming at the problem from as many perspectives as you can and not understanding it through metaphors like levers of change or magic bullet. It's not a linear understanding. There is no such thing as a magic bullet in this perspective. There isn't a particular lever of change at all. Now, if you're as old as I am and you've been around as long as I am, you might remember some of the debates in neo-Marxist theory about structural approaches to change and the contrasting view about agency-oriented approaches to change. And so, for example, where I come from, the classic debate that happened was, well, what caused apartheid to fall? Was it the individuals in the personae of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk? Or if you argue from a more strongly structuralist perspective, you might say that no, it was because economic sanctions actually helped to bankrupt South Africa's government, and so it was much deeper structural forces which enabled that change to happen. But you can also not deny the importance of individuals like Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk as well. And so that led to the sort of agency structure debate in the field. And that just by way of leading us into a contrast by looking at what complexity theory would argue, and that is that it would say that there are multiple factors, varied factors, which contribute to change, and it's all about metaphors that you've heard, like critical mass and emergent phenomena and incredible scale in the system. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple of metaphors again to try and understand it. And the best ones, I suppose, are the really easy ones, like where does life come from, or what is consciousness? And if we go to the consciousness one, it should strike you as fairly amazing that there is an agglomeration of cells in our heads which somehow gives rise to something called consciousness, and surely one of the most difficult things to understand. And I suppose at the most elementary level of looking at that, what we can see happening is that when you have incredible scale, I'm not pointing to my head in particular. I'm sure there is more incredible scale in a lot of heads out there. But when you've got a lot of cells in there, and they're connected by a greater number of neurons, a greater number of connections. In other words, when you have a number of elements in the system, the connections amongst them are exponentially greater than the number of constituent elements. That's really very important. And also, if you have a number of different kinds of agents in the system, as it were, and so the so-called primordial soup out of which life originated and consisted of a whole lot of different elements, a whole lot of different constituents, which connected in some way, and ultimately that led to some autocatalytic process of change which sustained itself and so on. But the point here is that new properties and behaviors, consciousness, emerges once a critical mass is reached. Nobody knows, or it's very hard to predict what that critical mass is, but new things emerge, new properties, new behaviors, once critical mass is reached in a system. The problem is that we can't easily predict from a knowledge of initial conditions when critical mass will be reached and what those emergent properties and behaviors are going to be. You probably have heard the metaphor of the butterfly effect in chaos theory, which is very close to complexity theory. Lorenz talked about this, and I think the origin is he submitted a paper at a conference and he couldn't get the title right. So somebody else said, okay, how about we title the paper, "Does the flapping of a butterfly's wings in Brazil lead to a tornado in Texas?" Now, if you think about that, even the verb lead to is not a good verb at all. You certainly can't say cause, because if you're standing at that point in time and there is a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, you cannot know, standing right there, what the salience of that particular factor is in the whole agglomeration of factors which constitute weather systems. But somehow, that small flap of that butterfly's wings, in conjunction with other factors in the weather system at the time, will contribute to a much greater effect than those wings themselves. So we're talking about a myriad contributing factors, unclear salience of each, very difficult to know what's going to matter, and a minimum degree of predictability. But from our perspectives in education, at least we have a good idea of what works in education. So if we come into a system and say, well, we want to change this, we at least have a pretty good idea, and we've been talking about a lot of those factors this week, about what will make for positive change in the education system where we're working. I just want to introduce a couple of other metaphors again. Economists talk about lock-in of particular phenomena, and a good way to understand this, and a frequently quoted example, is of the dominance of QWERTY keyboards. All of us here are typing on QWERTY keyboards, I'm sure. Now, there are much faster keyboards available. The QWERTY keyboard is actually very inefficient. If you look at it, the E, I think, and the S and the popular letters are not in the resting position if anybody types with 10 fingers. And the reason for that is obvious, that when typewriters were introduced, if you were typing too fast as a touch typist, the things would jam up against the paper. So they consciously designed keyboard layouts to slow typists down. And then one layout, the QWERTY layout, was adopted by a company called Remington, which you've probably heard of. And so more typists learned on Remington keyboards, on QWERTY keyboards, as more were sold and so on. And that led to lock-in of that particular phenomenon. And so you get this kind of snowball effect of the dominance of that. And we've seen similar battles recently between, I think, VHS and beta tapes a few years ago. And so metaphors like lock-in, metaphors like snowball, and compounding effects are how we need to understand what change is. And so you can see now that Darwinian evolution is actually a theory. It's a complexity theory, because what becomes absolutely crucial is feedback in the system. That as random variations in the system occur, and those which are more suited to environmental effects, those feedbacks will compound, and you'll get positive feedback loops, and so on. So I tend to use a term from physics to talk about things gaining inertial momentum. Now, I know we talk about inertia as things standing still and their resistance to move, but physicists also talk about inertial momentum, that things resist stopping as well when they're moving. And I tend to think of change if I hold my hand out and say, well, here's where things are now, and things could go in any one of 5 directions. And which one are they going to go into? It depends on that kind of battle over QWERTY keyboards, or that kind of battle over VHS and beta, and a myriad factors that are contributing to that. And so one understands the nature of change both in terms of direction and in terms of speed. So if you're a mathematician, you'll know that that's vectors. So one needs to conceptualize the nature of change being locked in a particular direction in terms of both speed and direction. Okay, what are the consequences of that for educational change and for initiating or precipitating educational change and trying to sustain it? I think that what's ineffective is piecemeal and isolated change. There's a saying in English which is too rude to say up here, but it's something like peeing into the wind. It doesn't help at all. It gets completely dissipated and it's useless. So when I hear of initiatives where people go into some remote community and they leave computers there, that's going to come to naught, probably. They've forgotten that there's no electricity there, probably, and that nobody knows how to use the computers, and that there's a lot of dust, and the computers probably will just rot there. Or going into a particular community and giving teachers 1 session of professional development and then leaving. Those kinds of things simply aren't going to have an impact. And this is a lot of common sense after all. And so what the complexity theorists will argue is that effective intervention means intervention at every possible level, as I said, and from every possible angle. And what that comes down to in the development game is integrated service delivery. And I think Nick had it on the board where he said, I could talk to you about deworming, I could talk to you about nutrition, I could talk to you about clean water. I think he had those. Was it Nick Burnett who had those on the slide? And it seems to me that if we really want to make a difference in any particular educational community, it means we've got to come in with as many resources as we can, concentrated resources, and marshalling them all at the problem from as many different directions as we can and at every possible level. So it could be teacher professional development, it could also be school feeding programs, it could also be deworming and clean water and so on. In other words, using the infrastructure of schooling as a social policy instrument as well. I talked to some colleagues earlier about how in Cuba, certainly I saw in Havana, schools are used as daycare centers from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock in the evening. Not that the teachers are there all the time, but there are daycare workers there early to enable parents to work and so on. So it means concentrating resources in that sense to try to precipitate something which will then slowly lead to autocatalysis, where it catalyzes itself and the change continues on its own. That raises at least one difficult issue, which is an ethical issue of targeting your resources in one particular community, which means other communities go without those resources because there isn't an infinite number of resources available to us. But that's a separate issue. But in terms of understanding change, I think that's how we need to understand what it is and how we precipitate it and how we help to sustain it. I have an article in the International Journal of Education Development on this, and if anybody wants it, you could email me and I will email it to you. Thanks, Michael.